A powerful black millionaire, accustomed to getting everything he wants, forces a marriage with a girl to secure his empire. But when he discovers an unexpected truth about her purity, his life takes a turn he never anticipated. What starts as a calculated move becomes a journey of transformation, love, and redemption. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Stay tuned for this gripping story of power, secrets, and unexpected discoveries. The dimly lit office was as grand as it was intimidating, with its high ceilings and towering shelves filled with leather-bound books. Nathaniel Carter, a black millionaire known for his ruthless business acumen, sat behind a mahogany desk, his gaze sharp and unyielding. He was a man who never compromised, and today was no exception. "I don't care about her feelings," Nathaniel said coldly, his voice like steel. "This marriage isn't about love. It's about control." His lawyer, a wiry man in his 50s, adjusted his glasses nervously. "Mr. Carter, I understand your position, but forcing someone into a marriage could have consequences." "Legal consequences that I've already mitigated," Nathaniel interrupted, leaning forward. "Her family is drowning in debt, and I'm the lifeline they need. She'll agree, and if she doesn't, her father will make her." The girl in question, Isabella Moreno, was nothing like the women Nathaniel usually encountered. She was shy, reserved, and far removed from the glamorous socialites who threw themselves at him. Nathaniel didn't care about her personality or her dreams. To him, she was just a pawn in a much larger game, a means to solidify a deal that would secure his business empire. The day of the meeting came quickly. Isabella entered Nathaniel's office with her father, her petite frame and delicate features contrasting starkly with the imposing figure of Nathaniel. Her dark brown eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding his piercing gaze. "This is Isabella," her father said, his tone tinged with desperation. "She understands the terms." Nathaniel stood, his towering presence filling the room. "Do you, Isabella? Do you understand what this marriage entails?" She nodded slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched the hem of her modest dress. "Yes," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Good. The wedding will be in 3 days." The ceremony was a quiet affair, held in Nathaniel's sprawling estate. Isabella wore a simple white dress, her movements graceful yet hesitant. Nathaniel, ever composed, stood beside her, his expression a mask of indifference. As the officiant recited the vows, Nathaniel's gaze flickered to Isabella. For a brief moment, he saw something in her eyes: fear, vulnerability, and a strength she was trying desperately to hold on to. It was a fleeting moment, but it unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. When the ceremony ended, Nathaniel escorted Isabella to her new room, a luxurious suite far from his own. "This is where you'll stay," he said curtly, his tone devoid of warmth. "You're free to do as you please within the house, but don't forget why you're here." Isabella nodded, her face pale but resolute. As Nathaniel turned to leave, she finally spoke. "Why are you doing this?" He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Because I can," he said simply, before walking out. That night, Nathaniel sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand. He told himself this was just another business transaction, no different from the countless deals he'd made before. But as he replayed the day in his mind, he couldn't shake the image of Isabella's eyes, the quiet defiance beneath her fear. He didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about power, control, and what it meant to truly care for someone. The first few days of their marriage were marked by silence. Nathaniel and Isabella barely exchanged words, their interactions limited to brief moments in the expansive halls of his mansion. For Nathaniel, this arrangement suited him perfectly. He had no interest in building a connection with her. To him, she was merely a contractual obligation. But Isabella, quiet and observant, began to notice things about him that didn't align with the ruthless man she'd been warned about. He was cold, yes, but not cruel. He provided her with everything she could need: clothes, books, and even a small art studio when he learned she liked to paint. It wasn't kindness, she told herself, it was indifference. Nathaniel, however, found himself distracted in ways he hadn't anticipated. He told himself he didn't care what Isabella thought or felt, yet he couldn't ignore the way her presence lingered in his mind. Her reserved demeanor and soft-spoken words were a stark contrast to the loud, demanding people he was used to. One evening, as Nathaniel sat in his study reviewing documents, there was a soft knock at the door. He frowned. No one interrupted him here. "Come in," he said, his voice steady but curious. The door creaked open, and Isabella stepped inside, her small frame dwarfed by the grandeur of the room. She clutched a book to her chest, her fingers gripping the edges nervously. "I don't mean to bother you," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to say thank you for the art studio." Nathaniel looked up, surprised. "You're welcome," he said curtly, returning his gaze to his papers. But Isabella didn't leave. She stood there for a moment, gathering her courage. "Why did you do it?" she asked suddenly. Nathaniel glanced at her, his eyes narrowing. "Why do you care?" Her cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. "Because it doesn't make sense. You forced me into this marriage, but then you give me something I love. I don't understand you." For a moment, Nathaniel didn't respond. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. "You're overthinking it," he said finally. "I wanted you to be occupied, that's all." Isabella nodded, though his answer left her with more questions than before. She excused herself and left the room, her mind swirling with confusion. Later that night, Nathaniel found himself replaying the interaction. Why had he given her the studio? It wasn't part of their agreement, and he certainly didn't owe her anything. But the look on her face when she thanked him, the genuine gratitude in her eyes, had stirred something in him. Shaking his head, he pushed the thought aside. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. The following day, Nathaniel arrived home earlier than usual. As he walked past the art studio, he heard soft music playing. His curiosity got the better of him, and he paused at the slightly ajar door. Peering inside, he saw Isabella, completely absorbed in her painting. Her auburn hair fell over her face as she worked, her hands moving with practiced ease. There was a peacefulness about her, a quiet determination that caught him off guard. For a man who thrived on control and precision, seeing her so free and unguarded was unsettling. Before he could stop himself, he pushed the door open. Isabella looked up, startled, her brush freezing mid-stroke. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Nathaniel said, his voice unusually soft. "It's fine," she said quickly, stepping back from the canvas. He walked over, his eyes scanning the painting. It was a landscape, soft, muted tones that evoked a sense of serenity. "You're talented," he said, surprising even himself. "Thank you," she replied, her voice laced with uncertainty. They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable. Nathaniel cleared his throat, taking a step back. "Dinner is at 7, he said abruptly before leaving the room. Isabella watched him go, her heart pounding. She didn't know what to make of him, but she could sense there was more to Nathaniel Carter than the cold businessman he portrayed. And for the first time, she wondered if she might be able to break through the walls he'd built around himself. Days turned into weeks, and the silence that had once defined their relationship began to shift. Isabella kept to herself for the most part, spending her time painting or reading in the mansion's library. But occasionally, her path would cross with Nathaniel's, and their brief interactions grew increasingly layered with tension and curiosity. Nathaniel found himself noticing things he hadn't before. How Isabella's hair shimmered under the sunlight streaming through the windows, the quiet determination in her eyes when she spoke, or the way her presence filled the room without effort. These observations unsettled him. He was a man who thrived on control, yet she was an enigma he couldn't decipher. One evening, as Nathaniel sat alone in the dining room, Isabella entered hesitantly. She wasn't one to join him, often eating in the privacy of her suite. But tonight, something was different. "Do you mind if I sit here?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked up, startled by her request, but gestured to the chair across from him. "Of course." She sat down, smoothing the skirt of her modest dress. The air between them was thick with unspoken words as the butler brought out their meal. They ate in silence for a while before Isabella spoke. "Do you ever take time for yourself?" she asked, her tone careful but curious. Nathaniel glanced at her, his fork pausing mid-air. "What do you mean?" "You're always working," she said, her voice gaining a bit of confidence. "It's like you never stop to enjoy anything." He frowned, setting his fork down. "Enjoyment is a luxury I don't have time for. Everything I do is for a purpose." Isabella tilted her head, studying him. "But what's the point of all this?" She gestured to the grand dining room, the lavish mansion. "If you don't take a moment to live." Her words struck a nerve. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, his expression guarded. "You don't understand what it takes to get where I am. Sacrifices have to be made." "Maybe," she said quietly. "But what's the point of success if you're alone?" Her question lingered in the air, and for the first time in years, Nathaniel found himself at a loss for words. Later that night, Nathaniel found himself in the library, a glass of whiskey in hand. Isabella's words replayed in his mind, stirring something he hadn't felt in a long time. Doubt. He stared at the shelves of books, their leather spines gleaming in the dim light, and wondered if she was right. When Isabella passed by the library, she noticed the faint glow of light and hesitated. Gathering her courage, she stepped inside. "I didn't mean to upset you earlier," she said softly. Nathaniel looked up, surprised by her presence. "You didn't upset me," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. She walked closer, her hands clasped nervously. I've seen the weight you carry. You don't have to pretend it's not there." Her words were gentle but disarming, cutting through the walls he'd built around himself. For a moment he didn't respond, his gaze locked on hers. "Why do you care?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I think there's more to you than what you let people see," she replied, her eyes steady. "And I think you're afraid to let anyone in." Nathaniel's breath caught, her honesty striking him harder than he cared to admit. He looked away, his jaw tightening. "You don't know me, Isabella." "Maybe not," she said softly, "but I'd like to." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Nathaniel felt the cracks in his armor widening. The next morning, Nathaniel found himself standing outside the art studio. He hadn't planned on visiting, but his feet had carried him there. Peeking through the slightly open door, he saw Isabella working on another painting. She didn't notice him at first, completely absorbed in her work. But when she finally looked up and saw him, her eyes widened slightly. "Good morning," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Good morning," he replied, stepping inside. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," she said, smiling. He walked closer, his gaze falling on the canvas. It was another landscape, this one brighter and more vibrant than the last. "You have a talent," he said, his tone genuine. "Thank you," she replied, her cheeks flushing. Nathaniel hesitated before speaking again. "I was wondering, would you like to join me for dinner tonight?" Her eyes widened in surprise, but she nodded. "I'd like that." As he left the studio, a strange feeling settled in his chest, a mixture of hope and unease. For the first time in years, Nathaniel Carter felt the faint stirrings of something he couldn't control. The dining room that evening felt different, as though the walls themselves sensed the shift between Nathaniel and Isabella. The long table, once a symbol of formality and distance, now seemed to draw them closer. A soft glow from the chandelier cast warm light on the room, adding a sense of intimacy Nathaniel couldn't ignore. Isabella entered the room wearing a modest yet elegant dress, the soft fabric flowing around her as she moved. Nathaniel, already seated, stood as she approached. "You look lovely," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "Thank you," she replied, her cheeks flushing slightly. "You look nice too." The meal began in silence, the clinking of cutlery, the only sound between them. Isabella glanced at Nathaniel, noticing how he seemed different tonight, less guarded, more present. "I wanted to thank you," she said finally, breaking the quiet. "For what?" he asked, looking up from his plate. "For inviting me tonight," she said, her voice steady. "It's nice to talk to you like this." Nathaniel hesitated, her sincerity catching him off guard. "I suppose I've been preoccupied," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean I don't notice things." Her brow furrowed slightly. "What do you mean?" "You're not like anyone I've ever met," he said, setting his fork down. "You're quiet but strong, reserved but not afraid to speak your mind when it matters. It's refreshing." Isabella blinked, surprised by his candor. "I think that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. Nathaniel chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Don't get used to it." As the meal progressed, their conversation grew more comfortable, flowing from one topic to another with ease. Nathaniel found himself talking about things he hadn't shared with anyone in years. His upbringing, his struggles to build his empire, and the sacrifices he'd made along the way. Isabella listened intently, her eyes never leaving his. "That sounds lonely," she said, after he finished recounting a particularly difficult period in his life. "It was," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "But loneliness is a small price to pay for success." "Is it?" she asked, her tone thoughtful. "Because from where I'm sitting, it seems like you've gained the world, but lost yourself in the process." Nathaniel stared at her, her words striking a chord he hadn't expected. No one had ever spoken to him like that, so honestly, without fear or ulterior motives. "I suppose you think I should change," he said, a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone. "I think you should find out what really makes you happy," she replied simply, "and maybe stop running from it." After dinner, Nathaniel offered to walk Isabella to her suite. The hallway was dimly lit, the soft glow of sconces casting long shadows on the walls. As they walked, the silence between them felt less like a barrier and more like a quiet understanding. When they reached her door, Isabella turned to face him. "Thank you for tonight," she said, her voice warm. Nathaniel nodded, his gaze steady. "You're welcome." For a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them thick with unspoken tension. Nathaniel raised a hand, hesitating briefly before brushing a strand of hair from her face. His fingers lingered on her cheek, the touch both gentle and deliberate. "You're not what I expected, Isabella," he said softly. "And neither are you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The moment stretched, their gazes locked as something unspoken passed between them. But just as quickly as it began, Nathaniel stepped back, his hand falling to his side. "Good night," he said, his tone returning to its usual composed calm. "Good night," Isabella replied, watching as he walked away. That night, as Nathaniel lay in bed, he couldn't shake the image of Isabella's face, the warmth of her skin beneath his fingertips. For years, he had convinced himself that emotions were weaknesses, distractions that had no place in his life. But now, he wasn't so sure. Isabella, too, found sleep elusive. She replayed the evening in her mind, the moments of connection that had surprised and disarmed her. Despite everything, how their relationship had started, the power imbalance between them, she couldn't deny the growing pull she felt toward him. For both of them, it was a night of vulnerability, the cracks in their walls growing wider as they began to question the paths they had chosen. The following days were marked by a noticeable shift between Nathaniel and Isabella. Their interactions, once cold and distant, grew warmer, layered with a subtle understanding neither dared to fully acknowledge. Nathaniel found himself looking forward to their conversations, and Isabella, despite her initial reluctance, began to see glimpses of a man beneath the hardened exterior. One evening, Nathaniel returned home earlier than usual, his mind weighed down by the stresses of a particularly challenging day. He found Isabella in the garden, seated on a stone bench surrounded by blooming roses. The soft twilight cast a golden glow over her, and for a moment he hesitated, unsure if he should interrupt. "Rough day?" Isabella asked without turning, sensing his presence. "How could you tell?" he replied, stepping closer. "You look tired," she said, glancing at him with a faint smile. "And you're never home this early, unless something's bothering you." Nathaniel chuckled softly, sitting down beside her. "You've gotten good at reading me." "It's not hard when you're not trying to hide it," she said, her voice teasing but gentle. They sat in silence for a while, the cool evening air carrying the faint scent of roses. Finally, Nathaniel spoke. "I never expected you to adapt to this life so easily." "I wouldn't say it's been easy," Isabella replied, "but I've learned to find peace in small things, like this garden." Nathaniel nodded, his gaze distant. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for." Later that evening, as Isabella prepared for bed, there was a soft knock at her door. Opening it, she found Nathaniel standing there, his expression unreadable. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone serious. "Of course," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. Nathaniel hesitated before speaking, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for the right words. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," he said finally. "Something that's been bothering me since the beginning." Isabella frowned, unsure of where this was going. "What is it? Why did you agree to this marriage?" he asked, his voice low. "Your father might have pressured you, but you could have refused. Why didn't you?" She looked away, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "Because I didn't have a choice," she admitted. "My family's debt was suffocating us. My father said this was the only way to save us." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, a pang of guilt cutting through him. He had known, of course, but hearing her say it made it feel more real. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft. "It's not your fault," she replied, meeting his gaze. "But I made my peace with it. I told myself that if this was my fate, I'd make the best of it." Her words struck Nathaniel deeply, and for the first time, he began to see the sacrifices she had made not as weakness, but as immense strength. As the conversation continued, Nathaniel's curiosity got the better of him. "You've never talked about your past," he said. "What was your life like before all this?" Isabella hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "There's not much to tell," she said quietly. "I grew up in a small town, went to school, helped my family. That's it." Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "There's more, isn't there?" She looked down, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never been with anyone before." The confession hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Nathaniel's breath caught, the weight of her words hitting him like a freight train. "You mean—" Isabella nodded, her cheeks flaming with embarrassment. "Yes. I'm untouched." Nathaniel stared at her, his mind racing. He had assumed she was like the others, worldly, experienced, accustomed to the games of power and manipulation, but this revelation shattered that image entirely. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Because it didn't seem to matter," she said, her eyes glistening. "I didn't think you'd care." Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair, his emotions swirling. He had forced this marriage, believing it to be a calculated move. But now, faced with the truth of who Isabella really was, he felt an unfamiliar pang of shame. "You're not what I expected," he said finally, his voice tinged with regret. "And neither are you," she replied, her gaze steady. "But maybe that's not a bad thing." That night, Nathaniel couldn't sleep. Isabella's confession replayed in his mind, forcing him to confront feelings he hadn't acknowledged before. He had built his empire on control, on bending others to his will, but Isabella's quiet strength and honesty were undoing him piece by piece. For the first time, he wondered if this marriage, which had started as a means to an end, could become something more. The following morning, the house was unusually quiet. Nathaniel sat in his study, staring at the untouched cup of coffee on his desk. Isabella's words from the previous night lingered in his mind, unraveling the carefully constructed narrative he'd built around their marriage. She wasn't like anyone he'd ever encountered, and the realization left him unsettled. He had forced her into this marriage, treating her like a pawn in his game of power. But now, faced with her honesty and vulnerability, he began to see her not as a piece in his plan, but as a person, strong, resilient, and far more selfless than he could ever hope to be. Isabella, on the other hand, found herself feeling a strange sense of relief after their conversation. She had carried the weight of her secret for so long, fearing judgment or ridicule, but Nathaniel's reaction had been unexpected. He hadn't mocked her or dismissed her feelings. Instead, he had listened, his expression softening in a way she hadn't thought possible. That afternoon, she decided to visit the garden, hoping the tranquility of the space would help clear her mind. As she wandered among the blooming flowers, she heard footsteps behind her. "You always come here when you're thinking," Nathaniel said, his deep voice breaking the silence. Isabella turned to see him standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "It's peaceful here," she replied. "It helps me make sense of things." Nathaniel nodded, stepping closer. "I wanted to talk to you about last night." Her heart skipped a beat. "What about it?" "I've been thinking," he began, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant. "I've spent my entire life taking what I want, controlling every aspect of my world. But with you, it's different. You've made me question things I've never questioned before." Isabella tilted her head, studying him. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I've treated you unfairly," he said, his voice filled with regret. "This marriage started as a transaction, a way to solidify my empire. But now, I see how wrong I was. You deserved better." She stared at him, her emotions swirling. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want to make things right," Nathaniel said, stepping closer. "I don't want you to feel like you're trapped here. If you want to leave, I'll let you go. I'll take care of your family's debt. No strings attached." The offer stunned Isabella. She had resigned herself to this life, believing she had no choice. But now, Nathaniel was giving her an out, a chance to reclaim her freedom. She should have felt relieved, even grateful, but instead, she felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name. "What if I don't want to leave?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. Nathaniel's eyes widened slightly. "You don't?" She shook her head, her cheeks flushing. "I don't know what this is between us, but I think it's worth exploring. You've changed, Nathaniel. You're not the same man who forced me into this marriage." He took another step closer, their faces now inches apart. "And you're not the same woman I thought you were," he admitted. "You're stronger, braver, and far more forgiving than I deserve." Isabella smiled faintly, her green eyes locking onto his. "Maybe we've both changed." For the first time, Nathaniel allowed himself to be vulnerable. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Isabella's face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "I don't know where this will lead," he said, his voice low. "But I'm willing to find out, if you are." She placed her hand over his, her touch warm and reassuring. "I am," she said simply. The moment stretched between them, the air thick with unspoken promises. It wasn't the resolution either of them had expected, but it was a start, a tentative step toward something neither could fully define, but both were willing to fight for. That night, as Nathaniel sat in his study, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time, his empire didn't feel like the center of his world. Isabella had changed that, and he knew there was no going back. Isabella, too, felt a glimmer of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. This marriage, born out of coercion and necessity, had become something far more complicated and far more meaningful. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, they were facing it together. In the days that followed, Nathaniel and Isabella began to navigate their new dynamic cautiously. Dinners were no longer silent, and their conversations grew deeper. Nathaniel found himself drawn to her honesty, while Isabella saw glimpses of the man beneath the cold facade. One evening, as they walked through the garden, Nathaniel stopped and turned to her. "This isn't going to be easy," he admitted, "but I want to try." Isabella smiled, her fingers brushing his. "So do I." Nathaniel made good on his promise. He paid off Isabella's family's debts, ensuring their security without strings attached. When he told Isabella, her eyes filled with tears. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I did," Nathaniel replied softly, "because you deserve to be free, even if you choose to stay." Isabella knew then that his actions weren't just about redemption. They were about love. Their relationship transformed. What began as a contract turned into a partnership built on trust and respect. Nathaniel opened up about his past, while Isabella shared her dreams. Together, they rebuilt the foundation of their marriage. On their first anniversary, Nathaniel stood beside Isabella in the same garden where their journey began. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have," he said, "a reason to believe in more." "And you've shown me how strong love can be," Isabella replied, her smile radiant. They kissed under the stars, knowing their story was just beginning. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and leave a like. Share this video with someone who loves tales of redemption and love. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.